The Louisiana sun, thick and golden, draped itself over Lafayette, baking the sidewalks and turning the air languid. Mo cut the engine of his pickup, the sudden silence amplifying the city's hushed midday rhythm. He sat for a moment, hands still on the key, the cool leather of the steering wheel a welcome contrast to the rising heat. Maison DuLac shimmered before him, its pristine white facade reflecting the sunlight like a beacon of elegance. He'd seen pictures, of course, pored over the financials, scrutinized the menus, but seeing it in person, breathing in the humid air tinged with the faintest aroma of grilling seafood, a strange sense of ownership settled in his chest. Not pride, not yet, more a quiet anticipation, a flicker of the potential he saw nestled within these walls. He ran a hand over his jeans, smoothing non-existent wrinkles. The red of his t-shirt felt vibrant, almost defiant against the muted backdrop of the upscale establishment. He knew the attire was a test, a subtle probe into the heart of the restaurant's culture, the very culture he was here to change. He exited the truck, the click of the door echoing in the stillness. He approached the entrance, each step measured, deliberate. The heavy oak door, polished to a gleam, opened smoothly, revealing a cool, dimly lit interior. The immediate shift in temperature sent a shiver across his skin, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. The aroma inside was richer, more complex, a blend of butter, garlic, and something subtly floral. He paused, letting his eyes adjust to the change in light, taking in the hushed elegance of the dining room. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, casting intricate patterns of light on the crisp white tablecloths. Low murmurs of conversation drifted from the scattered, occupied tables, punctuated by the clinking of silverware. This was it, his restaurant. The thought felt strangely foreign, yet exhilarating. A young woman, impeccably dressed in a black dress and a starched white apron, approached him. Her name tag read Chloe. Her smile, initially welcoming, faltered slightly as her gaze swept over his attire. The shift was subtle, a fleeting tightening of her lips, a barely perceptible flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but Mo registered it instantly. These were the micro-expressions he'd trained himself to observe, the silent language of discomfort and prejudice. He held her gaze, his own expression neutral, a silent challenge in the depths of his dark eyes. "Good afternoon," Chloe began, her voice recovering its professional smoothness, though a hint of strain remained. "Do you have a reservation?" Her eyes darted again to his t-shirt, then back to his face, a question unspoken hanging in the air. "He doesn't belong here," her internal monologue screamed, clashing with her trained hospitality. "This is Maison DuLac, not some roadside diner." She fought to maintain her composure, the ingrained biases of her upbringing battling against her professional obligations. Perhaps he's just lost, she reasoned internally, desperately searching for an explanation that would reconcile his appearance with the restaurant's image. "No reservation," Mo replied, his voice calm, even. He enjoyed watching the subtle play of emotions across her face. He knew exactly what she was thinking, the assumptions she was making based on his clothes, on the truck he'd arrived in. It was a familiar script, one he'd encountered countless times before. He let a beat of silence hang in the air, letting the tension build, amplifying her discomfort. "I'm here to see Daryl." Chloe's brow furrowed slightly. "Daryl?" she echoed, the name unfamiliar in this context. She mentally ran through the list of staff, the regular patrons. No one fitting this man's description came to mind. Daryl the dishwasher? Surely not. The thought felt absurd, even insulting. "And you are?" she prompted, hoping for clarification, a clue that would resolve this unsettling dissonance. "Mo Greer," he answered, still holding her gaze. Inside, a flicker of amusement danced within him. He watched as recognition slowly dawned in her eyes, followed by a wave of disbelief, then a rising tide of panic. The transformation was almost comical, a rapid-fire sequence of emotions playing out across her face like a silent film. "Mr. Greer," Chloe stammered, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. Her mind raced, scrambling to reconcile the man before her with the image she'd conjured of the new owner. She'd expected someone different, someone older, more refined, someone who looked the part. The realization of her blunder hit her with the force of a physical blow. The red t-shirt, she thought, mortified. The jeans. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, staining her skin a fiery red. Yes, Mo confirmed, a hint of a smile finally playing at the corners of his lips. He could almost taste the regret radiating from her, the bitter tang of her misjudgment. He turned slightly, gesturing towards the dining room. Perhaps we could talk somewhere more private? Chloe, flustered and mortified, stammered an apology, leading him towards a secluded table in the back. A young waiter, Jaden, observing the exchange from a nearby station, watched with wide, uncertain eyes. He'd seen Chloe's initial reaction, the barely concealed disdain, and he'd instinctively mirrored it. Now he observed the dramatic shift in her demeanor, the sudden deference, the palpable anxiety. He felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. Who was this man in the red t-shirt? And what had just happened? He glanced towards Daryl, the manager, who was approaching them, a look of polite inquiry on his face. Daryl, too, seemed to register the change in atmosphere, the sudden shift in power dynamics. He extended a hand towards Mo, his smile professional, yet tinged with a cautious curiosity. "Mr. Greer?" Daryl inquired, his gaze flitting between Mo and the visibly shaken Chloe. "Welcome to Maison DuLac. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Daryl," Mo replied, his voice calm and reassuring, yet carrying an undercurrent of authority that resonated through the room. "I just wanted to have a chat, get a feel for the place." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the restaurant, taking in the elegant decor, the hushed atmosphere, the subtle nuances of the clientele. "We need to talk about the culture here, Daryl," he continued, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "I think it needs adjusting." Jaden watched, mesmerized, as Daryl's expression shifted from polite curiosity to something akin to apprehension. He could feel the air thicken with unspoken tension, a silent acknowledgement of the change that was about to sweep through Maison DuLac. The restaurant, once a bastion of quiet exclusivity, now felt charged with an electric uncertainty, a premonition of the storm brewing beneath the surface of its polished facade. The man in the red t-shirt, the unassuming owner, had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. The heavy oak door of Maison DuLac swung inward, the subtle chime of a bell announcing a new arrival. The air inside, cool and scented with a delicate blend of lilies and old money, was a stark contrast to the humid Louisiana afternoon. Sunlight, filtered through the intricate stained glass windows, painted kaleidoscopic patterns across the polished marble floor. Chloe, poised at the hostess stand, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair gleaming under the strategically placed spotlights, barely glanced up from the reservation book. She expected the usual Lafayette lunchtime crowd starched shirts, summer dresses, the occasional politician in a tailored suit. What she saw instead was a man in a faded red t-shirt and jeans, a worn canvas messenger bag slung across his shoulder. A faint frown creased her brow. "He looks like he's lost," she thought, a flicker of annoyance sparking within her. He certainly didn't fit the Maison DuLac image. "Probably here for a delivery," she concluded, her fingers already reaching for the delivery entrance code. The man, however, continued toward her, his gait steady and unhurried, his dark eyes taking in the surroundings with a quiet intensity that unnerved her slightly. There was an air about him, a subtle confidence that didn't quite match his casual attire. "You here for a delivery?" Chloe asked, her voice laced with a practiced politeness that barely masked her underlying dismissal. Her eyes flickered towards the back entrance, subtly urging him in that direction. "No, just here for lunch," he replied, his voice calm and even a hint of a southern drawl softening the edges. Chloe's smile faltered, her carefully constructed composure momentarily shaken. A man in a t-shirt, wanting to dine at Maison DuLac? It was almost unthinkable. Her internal monologue churned. This wasn't some backwoods diner. This was Maison DuLac, a bastion of culinary excellence and refined elegance. Her gaze swept over him again, taking in the worn edges of his jeans, the simple, unbranded t-shirt. What does he think he is? The thought clung to her, a persistent, buzzing fly in the pristine air of the restaurant. Well, she began, her voice tight with forced professionalism. We usually take lunch by reservation only, and she hesitated, her gaze pointedly landing on his attire. We usually require a collared shirt. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken judgment. He paused, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of something unreadable passing through their depths. Chloe shifted uneasily under his gaze. It was unnervingly steady, devoid of the embarrassment or defensiveness she expected. For a fleeting moment, a prickle of doubt touched her. Perhaps she'd misjudged him. Perhaps he was someone important, someone who simply chose to dress down. But the doubt quickly dissipated, replaced by a surge of irritation. People like him should know their place. They shouldn't be disrupting the carefully curated atmosphere of establishments like Maison DuLac. Understand, he said, his voice still calm, but I'm Maurice Greer. I believe I own the place now. The word struck Chloe with the force of a physical blow. The air around her seemed to thicken, the subtle scent of lilies turning cloyingly sweet, almost suffocating. Her carefully constructed facade crumbled, replaced by a stunned silence. Maurice Greer. The name echoed in her mind, a name she'd heard whispered among the staff, a name synonymous with the recent change in ownership. She had pictured someone different, someone in a suit, someone radiating power and wealth. Not this. Shame, hot and prickly, flooded her cheeks. She stammered, her carefully rehearsed greetings dissolving into a jumble of apologies and half-formed explanations. Her mind raced, frantically trying to process the enormity of her blunder. She had judged a man, dismissed him based solely on his appearance, and that man happened to be her new boss. Daryl, the restaurant manager, emerged from the back office, his crisp white shirt and perfectly knotted tie a stark contrast to Mo's casual attire. He noticed the tension at the hostess stand, the strained expression on Chloe's face, the quiet figure of the man in the red t-shirt. He approached, his brow furrowed in concern. "Is everything all right, Chloe?" Before Chloe could respond, Mo turned, his gaze meeting Daryl's. "I'm Maurice Greer," he said, extending a hand. "The new owner." Daryl's eyes widened in recognition, the professional mask he wore slipping for a fraction of a second. He grasped Mo's hand, his grip firm, his smile a mixture of surprise and deference. "Mr. Greer, welcome. I wasn't expecting you until later this week." He glanced at Chloe, a question in his eyes. Chloe, still flustered, managed a weak, "I didn't recognize you, sir." Her voice was barely above a whisper, the shame still burning in her throat. Mo's gaze returned to her, his expression unreadable. "It's understandable," he said, his voice neutral, devoid of any hint of accusation. "I prefer to keep things informal." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the elegant dining room, the meticulously arranged tables, the pristine white linens. "But perhaps," he added, his voice soft, yet carrying a weight that resonated through the stillness, "a little less formality, a little more inclusivity wouldn't hurt." Jaden, a young waiter polishing silverware at a nearby table, observed the exchange with wide, nervous eyes. He had overheard Chloe's initial dismissal of Mo and had cringed inwardly. He'd felt a flicker of sympathy for the stranger, a sense of unease at Chloe's blatant prejudice. Now, watching the shift in power, the sudden deference from both Chloe and Daryl, he felt a ripple of something akin to awe. This quiet, unassuming man in a red t-shirt had just subtly, yet powerfully, asserted his authority, and in doing so, had exposed the ingrained biases within the very fabric of Maison DuLac. Jaden knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that things were about to change. The heavy oak door of Maison DuLac whispered closed behind Maurice, the soft click a stark contrast to the sudden hush that seemed to fall over the small waiting area. He took a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim, elegant interior. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, painting dust motes dancing in the air with a soft, ethereal glow. The scent of aged wood and something subtly floral, perhaps lilies, hung in the air, a delicate perfume that spoke of old money and quiet sophistication. He wasn't entirely comfortable, his simple red t-shirt and worn jeans feeling oddly out of place amidst the hushed grandeur. A flicker of self-doubt, a fleeting thought perhaps he should have dressed up a bit. But he pushed it aside. This was his place now, or at least mostly his. He wanted to see it, experience it as it truly was, not as it pretended to be for a visitor in a suit. The hostess, Chloe, a young woman with meticulously styled blonde hair and a smile that hadn't quite reached her eyes, approached. He'd noticed her hesitation, the almost imperceptible tightening of her lips when she first saw him. "Table for one?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. He could practically hear the unspoken addendum. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" "Yes, please," Maurice replied, his voice calm and even. He met her gaze directly, a gentle but unwavering look. He knew what she was thinking. He'd seen that look before, the polite dismissal, the subtle judgment. It sparked a flicker of annoyance, a low burn in his gut, but he tamped it down, focusing on the task at hand. Observation. Assessment. Chloe's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Perhaps the deli next door might be more suitable," she suggested, her voice trailing off, laced with a delicate, almost apologetic disdain. Her internal monologue, however, was less refined. "Jeans and a t-shirt? In Maison DuLac. This is going to be a disaster. Daryl's going to kill me." She glanced nervously towards the back, where the manager, Daryl, was engrossed in a conversation with a supplier. She desperately hoped he hadn't overheard her. "I'm quite sure this will be fine," Maurice responded, a hint of steel creeping into his voice. He didn't miss the flicker of relief in her eyes when Daryl, a tall, impeccably dressed man with a perpetually harried expression, finally disengaged from his conversation and started towards them. Chloe's internal sigh of relief was almost audible. "Thank God, Daryl will handle this." Daryl approached, his brow furrowed in a slight frown. He gave Maurice a quick, assessing glance, taking in the casual attire. He opened his mouth to speak, likely echoing Chloe's subtle dismissal, when his eyes suddenly widened in recognition. The frown vanished, replaced by an expression of shocked realization. Something in his posture shifted, a subtle bowing, a deference that hadn't been there a moment before. "Mr. Greer," Daryl stammered, his voice hushed with a newfound respect. He cleared his throat, as if trying to erase his initial impression. "Mr. Greer, he's the new majority owner of Maison DuLac." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken implications. The delicate clinking of silverware against china, the hushed murmur of conversations, even the soft strains of classical music seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the stunned silence that followed Daryl's announcement. Chloe's carefully constructed composure crumbled. Her face, a moment before a mask of polite indifference, now paled, a mosaic of shock and embarrassment. Her eyes darted from Maurice to Daryl and back again, wide with disbelief. "Owner? This man? In a t-shirt?" Her mind raced, replaying the last few minutes, each word, each gesture, a testament to her blunder. Shame coiled in her stomach, a cold, tight knot. "He heard me. He knows what I thought." Jaden, a young waiter polishing glasses nearby, froze, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. He'd only been working at Maison DuLac for a few months, still navigating the intricate hierarchy and unspoken rules of the fine dining world. He'd witnessed Chloe's subtle snub, the almost imperceptible sneer. He'd felt a twinge of discomfort, a sense of unease that he couldn't quite articulate. Now, watching the color drain from Chloe's face, he understood. He'd witnessed a social earthquake, a tectonic shift in the very foundations of the restaurant's carefully curated world. Maurice, however, remained unfazed. He'd anticipated this reaction, this ripple of shock and readjustment. He gave Daryl a small, almost imperceptible nod. "A table by the window, if you please," he said, his voice calm and even, betraying none of the satisfaction he felt. Darrell, still flustered, gestured toward a secluded table near the back, overlooking the manicured gardens. "Of course, Mr. Greer. Right this way." He led Maurice to the table, pulling out a chair with an almost exaggerated flourish. As Maurice settled into the plush leather seat, he couldn't help but feel a sense of irony. This restaurant, with its hushed elegance and carefully cultivated air of exclusivity, was now his. He'd bought it not for the prestige, but for the challenge, the opportunity to reshape it, to dismantle the subtle prejudices that permeated its very foundations. He took a deep breath, the delicate floral scent now tinged with the bitter tang of anticipation. The battle, he knew, had just begun. He glanced over at Chloe, who was still standing near the hostess stand, her face a mask of frozen mortification. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the dawning realization that her job, her carefully constructed world, was now in his hands. He felt a fleeting pang of sympathy, a momentary understanding of her predicament. But it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. This wasn't about punishment. It was about change. He picked up the menu, his eyes scanning the meticulously crafted descriptions, his mind already formulating a plan. The change, he decided, would start with lunch. The heavy oak door of Maison DuLac closed behind him with a soft, expensive thud, the kind that whispered of hushed conversations and discreet fortunes. Mo inhaled, the air thick with the aroma of butter, thyme, and something indefinably French. He'd imagined this moment for months, the culmination of a dream, a risk, a gamble on a legacy he barely knew. Now, standing in the hushed elegance of the restaurant, a simple red t-shirt and jeans against the backdrop of starched white linen, he felt a strange disconnect, a quiet hum of unease vibrating beneath the polished surface of anticipation. The hostess, a young woman with a meticulously crafted chignon and a name tag that read Chloe, looked up from her reservations book. Her smile, initially bright and welcoming, faltered, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her features. He watched the subtle shift, the way her eyes scanned him, lingering a beat too long on his casual attire, before returning to his face with a forced brightness that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Table for one?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes," Mo replied, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the complex emotions swirling within him. He'd anticipated this. He prepared for it. Yet a sliver of disappointment, sharp and unexpected, pricked at him. He'd hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the change of ownership, the meticulous legal transfer, might somehow precede him, altering the very air of the establishment. Chloe hesitated, her fingers hovering over the reservations book. "We're quite busy at the moment. There might be a short wait." Her gaze drifted towards the street, towards a brightly lit deli across the road. "There's a charming sandwich shop just across the street. Perhaps you'd prefer something quicker." The words hung in the air, delicate as spun sugar, yet laced with something bitter. Mo felt a slow, controlled anger begin to simmer within him. He knew exactly what she was doing, the subtle dismissal, the gentle nudge toward a place more suitable. He recognized the unspoken assumption, the judgment based on appearance, the ingrained prejudice that he was here to dismantle brick by painstaking brick. "I'm sure I can wait," he said, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He met her gaze, his own steady and unwavering. Chloe flushed, a delicate pink creeping up her neck. "Of course, sir," she stammered, her fingers now moving with a sudden, almost frantic, speed across the reservations book. "Right this way." She led him to a small table by the window, her back rigid, her steps clipped. He watched her go, the click of her heels echoing the disquiet in his own heart. He took his seat, the plush velvet a stark contrast to the rough denim of his jeans. He pulled out his phone, a familiar weight in his hand, a shield against the unsettling quiet. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here to observe, to assess, to understand the depth of the rot before he began to excise it. Across the restaurant, he could feel the weight of curious glances, the hushed whispers, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. He saw the young waiter, Jaden, hovering nervously near the bar, his eyes darting between him and Chloe, a clear reflection of the uncertainty rippling through the staff. He saw the manager, Daryl, a man with a carefully cultivated air of authority, emerge from the kitchen, his brow furrowed, his gaze fixed on him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. In the bustling heat of the kitchen, the tension was palpable. The rhythmic clatter of pans, the sizzle of butter, the sharp calls of the chefs, all were underscored by a current of unease. News traveled fast in a restaurant, especially news of the unexpected. The new owner, the mysterious Mr. Greer, had arrived, and he wasn't what they'd expected. "Did you see him?" One of the line cooks whispered, his voice hushed. "Jeans and a t-shirt?" "In Maison DuLac," another replied, incredulous. The head chef, a formidable woman with a steely gaze, silenced them with a sharp look. "Focus on your work," she commanded, her voice laced with an undercurrent of tension. Yet, even she couldn't entirely quell the whispers, the curious glances towards the dining room, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. Back in the dining room, Daryl approached Chloe, his expression carefully neutral. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice low. Chloe fidgeted, her gaze averted. "Just seating a guest." "The one in the red shirt." Daryl's voice held a note of incredulity. He'd heard the whispers, the ripple of surprise that had spread through the staff. "Yes," Chloe mumbled, her cheeks still flushed. Daryl sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He'd dealt with enough difficult customers, enough demanding requests, to recognize the subtle signs of discomfort, the unspoken biases that often simmered beneath the surface of polite service. He had a feeling the situation was different, more complex, more precarious. "Chloe," he began, his voice softening, "you told him to go to a sandwich shop. You know what that looks like." Chloe's eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing her face. "I didn't mean anything by it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He wasn't dressed appropriately." Daryl's gaze hardened. "Appropriately? He owns the place, Chloe. He can wear whatever he damn well pleases." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Chloe's face paled, the blood draining from her cheeks. The realization of her mistake, the magnitude of her misjudgment, hit her with the force of a physical blow. She'd insulted the owner, the man who held her livelihood in his hands. The implications rippled outwards, a silent shockwave through the carefully constructed facade of Maison DuLac. Jaden, watching from the sidelines, felt a shiver of unease run down his spine. He'd witnessed the entire exchange, the subtle dismissal, the quiet assertion of power. He understood, with a sudden clarity, that something fundamental was shifting within the restaurant, a change in the very air they breathed. The muted clinking of silverware against porcelain, the hushed murmur of conversations, the gentle strains of a cello sonata, these were the sounds that usually filled the hallowed halls of Maison DuLac. Today, however, a different kind of silence hung in the air, a thick, expectant quiet that seemed to cling to the starched white tablecloths and the polished gleam of the antique mahogany bar. M.O. Greer sat at his table by the window, a splash of vibrant red against the muted elegance of the restaurant. His simple t-shirt and jeans seemed to amplify the silence, a silent declaration against the unspoken rules of this place. He cut into his pan-seared snapper, the delicate flakes falling apart under his knife. The lemon butter sauce was exquisite, a testament to the chef's skill. Yet the taste seemed flat. The undercurrent of unease, the subtle but palpable tension in the room, had seeped into the very air he breathed, tainting even the exquisite flavors. He could feel their gazes, the waiters and the other diners, like pinpricks on his skin. He didn't need to look up to know they were watching him, dissecting his every move, his every bite. "They think I don't belong here," he thought, a flicker of something cold, hard, and sharp momentarily flashing in his eyes before vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "They think this place, this temple of haute cuisine, is above me." He continued to eat, his movements deliberate, unhurried. Each bite was a quiet assertion, a subtle challenge to the unspoken hierarchy of the room. He saw Chloe, the hostess, hovering near the entrance, her eyes darting towards him, then quickly away. He could almost taste her anxiety, the bitter tang of regret clinging to her like cheap perfume. He wondered if she remembered the look on his face, the flicker of amusement in his eyes, when she'd suggested the deli down the street. Across the room, Daryl, the manager, was in a hushed conversation with the head waiter, his face a mask of strained composure. Mo recognized the signs of a man caught in the crosshairs of uncertainty. He'd seen it countless times before, this delicate dance of power and perception. He knew Daryl was trying to gauge the situation, to understand how a man in a red t-shirt could possibly be sitting at one of their best tables, calmly eating his lunch as if he owned the place. Because he did. A waiter, a young man named Jaden, if Mo recalled correctly, approached his table, his hands trembling slightly as he refilled Mo's water glass. The young man's eyes were wide, his face pale. He's terrified, and Mo thought, a touch of weariness seeping into his bones. Terrified of making a mistake, of breaking some invisible rule he doesn't even understand. Mo gave the young man a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture meant to reassure, but Jaden seemed to shrink further under his gaze. He retreated quickly, almost stumbling over his own feet in his haste to escape. Mo finished his meal, the silence in the room growing heavier with each passing second. He placed his napkin on the table, the soft rustle of linen a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet. As he rose, Daryl approached, his face a carefully constructed mask of professional courtesy. "Mr. Greer," he began, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, "I hope everything is up to standard?" Mo met his gaze, his own expression unreadable. "Food's good," he replied, his voice quiet, almost too quiet. "We're having a meeting after I'm done." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, watching as Daryl's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Daryl swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Certainly, sir. Would you prefer to use the private dining room?" "No," Mo said, turning towards the window, his gaze fixed on the slow, languid flow of the Bayou Teche. "The main dining area will be fine." He could feel Daryl's confusion, the questions swirling behind his eyes. He knew Daryl was desperate to understand, to reconcile the image of the man in the red t-shirt with the title of owner. He could practically hear the man's thoughts. How could someone like this own Maison DuLac? But Mo offered no explanation, no further words. He stood there, a silent figure against the backdrop of the bustling city outside, the unspoken tension in the room amplifying his quiet power, a power that stemmed not from outward displays of wealth or authority, but from something deeper, something unseen. The silence was his weapon, the subtle unease his ally. He knew that this silence, this unspoken tension, would be the catalyst for change. He had come to Maison DuLac not just to eat lunch, but to dismantle the invisible walls, the subtle prejudices that permeated the very foundation of this establishment. And he would do it, not with a grand gesture, not with a fiery speech, but with the quiet, unwavering force of his presence. The meeting, he knew, would be just the beginning. The kitchen, usually a whirlwind of controlled chaos, was strangely subdued. The usual clatter of pots and pans, the sharp calls of the chefs, the rhythmic thump of the butcher's knife, all were muted, replaced by a low hum of anxiety. The news had spread like wildfire. The man in the red t-shirt, the man Chloe had tried to dismiss, was Mo Greer, the new majority owner. Whispers rippled through the ranks, carrying with them a potent cocktail of fear and uncertainty. The head chef, a stout, formidable woman named Marie, wiped her hands on her apron, her brow furrowed in thought. She'd built her reputation on the impeccable standards of Maison DuLac, on the unwavering adherence to tradition. This man, this disruption, it felt like a threat, a crack in the carefully constructed edifice she had spent years building. She watched as Daryl hurried through the swinging doors, his face pale, his steps quick and agitated. He called the staff together, his voice strained as he relayed the news of the impending meeting. A wave of unease washed over the room, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Jaden, the young waiter, stood near the back, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. He'd seen the look in Mr. Greer's eyes, the quiet intensity that seemed to see right through him. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that things at Maison DuLac were about to change. The muted clinking of silverware against fine china, the hushed murmur of conversations, the gentle strains of jazz, the usual symphony of Maison DuLac hung in the air, a fragile melody threatening to shatter. Mo stood in the small, plush lounge area, the red of his t-shirt a stark contrast against the muted beige and gold decor. It felt strange, this space that was now his, yet felt alien. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the staff assembled before him, a tableau of starched white and anxious expressions. He hadn't intended for this to be a grand announcement, a dramatic unveiling of the new proprietor. He'd wanted to observe, to understand the pulse of the restaurant before making any sweeping changes. But the incident with the hostess, it had forced his hand, exposed a festering wound beneath the veneer of elegance. His initial plan of quiet observation had morphed into a necessary intervention. Chloe, the hostess, stood near the front, her usually impeccable posture slightly slumped, her eyes fixed on the ornate Persian rug. Earlier, her smile had been brittle, practiced, reserved for a certain type of clientele. Now, a faint tremor ran through her hands, clutching a small notepad, as if it were a lifeline. He's just a man in a red t-shirt, she thought, the realization a bitter pill. And two treated him like shame coiled in her stomach, a cold not tightening with each passing second. She hadn't meant to be prejudiced, not really. It was just the way things were done, the ingrained expectations, the unspoken rules of this world of crisp linens and hushed tones. But the quiet strength in his eyes, the way he held himself, the subtle authority that radiated from him despite his casual attire, it chipped away at her carefully constructed defenses. Daryl, the manager, shifted uneasily from foot to foot, his perfectly coiffed hair seeming slightly askew. He hadn't known. How could he have not known? This casual man, dismissed so easily by Chloe, held the reins of their future. He'd seen the exchange at the entrance, the subtle dismissal, the redirection towards the deli next door. In that moment, he'd seen a reflection of his own complacency, his own acceptance of the unspoken hierarchy. Damage control, his mind raced. How do I fix this? Jaden, a young waiter, stood at the back, his eyes wide, taking in the scene. He'd witnessed the whole thing unfold, the initial dismissal, the quiet conversation with Daryl, the hushed phone calls, the growing realization that rippled through the staff. He felt a strange mix of anxiety and admiration. This man, so unassuming, yet possessing such quiet power. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene, yet he commanded the room. Jaden felt a subtle shift within him, a questioning of the norms he had so readily accepted. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Mo took a breath, the scent of aged wood and fine wine filling his lungs. This wasn't how he'd envisioned his first real interaction with his staff, but perhaps it was necessary. I walked in today wearing a red shirt and sneakers. He began, his voice calm, even. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He could see the discomfort etched on their faces, the subtle flinching as his gaze swept over them. Some of y'all didn't recognize me. That's fine. Another pause. He wasn't interested in reprimands. Not yet. He wanted understanding. He wanted change. But I expect people to be treated with respect, he continued, his voice gaining a subtle edge. Doesn't matter how they're dressed. Doesn't matter their background. Everyone who walks through that door deserves the same level of service, the same courtesy, the same respect. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Chloe's face burned with shame. He's right, she thought, the realization a sharp pang of guilt. I judged him. I dismissed him. She swallowed hard, the knot in her stomach tightening. She wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in her throat. Darryl felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. He had to say something, do something. "Of course, Mr. Greer," he stammered, his voice betraying his nervousness. We understand. This won't happen again." Mo met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "It shouldn't have happened in the first place, Darryl." His words weren't harsh, but they carried a weight that settled heavily in the room. "This isn't just about dress codes. It's about the culture we create, the values we uphold. I want Maison DuLac to be a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of how they look or where they come from." Jaden watched, his mind racing. He never heard anyone talk like this, so directly, so honestly. It was a revelation. He felt a spark of hope, a flicker of something new. He wanted to be a part of this change, this new era for Maison DuLac. Mo continued, his voice softening slightly. "This is a fresh start for all of us. I'm not here to tear things down. I'm here to build something better, something we can all be proud of. And that starts with treating each other and our guests with respect." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the room once more. "I trust I made myself clear." A chorus of murmured assents filled the room, the tension slowly beginning to dissipate. Mo nodded, a subtle shift in his demeanor, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sense of clarity, a shared understanding. The symphony of Maison DuLac was about to change its tune. The plush velvet of the lounge chair swallowed Mo a little deeper. Maison DuLac shimmered around him, a carefully constructed world of polished mahogany, gleaming silverware, and the hushed murmur of affluent conversation. The air, thick with the aroma of truffle oil and aged wine, felt heavy, a stark contrast to the humid Louisiana air outside. He traced the rim of his water glass, the cool crystal a small anchor in the swirling unease that had settled in his stomach. It wasn't the opulence that bothered him, not exactly. He'd seen enough of it in his life to be immune to its gilded charms. It was the subtle, almost invisible threads of exclusion that hung in the air, the kind that wrapped around you like a silken noose, tightening with every politely condescending smile. Chloe stood a few feet away, her posture rigid, her carefully applied makeup unable to mask the flicker of anxiety in her eyes. He could practically hear the frantic whirring of her thoughts, the internal debate raging within her. He'd seen it countless times before, that particular brand of discomfort, the kind that came from realizing you'd misjudged someone, and not just misjudged, but revealed a prejudice you hadn't even known you harbored. Chloe began, her voice barely a whisper, then trailed off, lost in the cavernous silence of the lounge. The crystal chandeliers hanging above seemed to amplify the awkwardness, their glittering facets reflecting her every hesitant movement. He met her gaze, his own steady and unwavering. There was no accusation in his eyes, no hint of the anger she probably expected. He understood. This wasn't about him, not really. It was about the insidious nature of assumptions, the way they burrowed into the fabric of society, shaping perceptions and dictating actions. He took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch a moment longer before speaking. "It happens," he said finally, his voice soft but firm, each word carefully measured. He remembered a similar incident years ago, a stuffy art gallery in New York. The dismissive glances, the subtle redirection towards the gift shop, the assumption that a young black man in a hoodie couldn't possibly be a serious art collector. The memory still stung, a dull ache that resonated with the present. He pushed it down, focusing on Chloe, on the present. This wasn't about dredging up old wounds. It was about preventing new ones. He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes, a momentary loosening of her tense posture. She'd expected anger, recrimination, maybe even a public display of his newfound power. She hadn't expected understanding. "It happens," he repeated, the phrase hanging in the air between them. "You assume somebody doesn't belong just because they don't look like what you pictured." He paused, giving her words time to sink in. He watched as her carefully constructed facade began to crumble, replaced by a raw vulnerability that was both unsettling and strangely compelling. He saw the internal struggle reflected in her eyes, the battle between ingrained prejudice and dawning realization. He knew this moment, this fragile tipping point, was crucial. "I didn't," she stammered, her voice choked with emotion. He could see the shame rising within her, the hot flush creeping up her neck. He held her gaze, offering a silent acknowledgement of her discomfort, but not letting her off the hook. Daryl, the manager, hovered nearby, his face a mask of bewildered concern. He'd been called over to handle the situation, the unruly customer, and now found himself witnessing something far more complex, something that defied his neatly categorized understanding of restaurant management. He opened his mouth to speak, to interject, to smooth things over, but Mo raised a hand, silencing him with a subtle gesture. This was a conversation that needed to happen, a bridge that needed to be built, without the interference of managerial platitudes. Jaden, the young waiter, stood frozen at the edge of the scene, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. He'd witnessed countless subtle acts of discrimination within the hallowed halls of Maison DuLac, the barely perceptible slights, the carefully veiled disdain, all directed at those who didn't quite fit the restaurant's carefully curated image of affluent elegance. He'd never seen anyone challenge it, not like this. Mo shifted slightly in his chair, the velvet cushions whispering against his jeans. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's about the next person who walks through that door. The person who maybe saved up for months to eat here. The person who's celebrating a special occasion. The person who just wants a good meal. They deserve to be treated with respect, regardless of what they're wearing, regardless of what you think they are." Chloe's eyes welled up, tears blurring her mascara. She swallowed hard, fighting back a sob. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The words were simple, almost inadequate, but they carried the weight of genuine remorse, the first tentative steps towards understanding. Mo nodded, accepting her apology without fanfare. "Don't be Chloe," he said softly, his voice laced with a gentle firmness. "Be better." The silence that followed was different now, no longer thick with awkwardness, but filled with a fragile sense of hope. A small crack had appeared in the carefully constructed wall of prejudice, a sliver of light filtering through the darkness. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was a start. The air in the lounge area of Maison DuLac, thick with the remnants of tension and a lingering scent of expensive coffee, began to settle. Mo leaned back against the plush velvet of the armchair, the rich crimson a stark contrast to his simple red t-shirt. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, some still clouded with doubt, others flickering with a newfound understanding. He had laid it all bare, his vision for the future of Maison DuLac, a future built not on exclusivity, but on genuine hospitality. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't resorted to the theatrics some might expect from a new owner flexing their authority. His quiet strength, however, resonated more powerfully than any outburst could have. "They think I'm naive," he thought, a wry smile playing at the corner of his lips. "They think this is some idealistic dream that will crumble under the weight of reality. Let them." Chloe stood near the back, her perfectly coiffed hair seeming slightly disheveled, a reflection of her inner turmoil. The initial disdain she had felt towards Mo had morphed into something akin to shame. She recalled the subtle curl of her lip, the dismissive wave of her hand towards the deli across the street. The memory burned like acid. "He probably thinks I'm a terrible person," she thought, her stomach clenching. "He probably wants to fire me." The thought sent a shiver down her spine. This job, this restaurant, it represented everything she had worked for. But beyond the fear, a flicker of something else ignited within her, a grudging respect for the man who had so calmly dismantled her preconceived notions. Daryl, his face pale and his tie slightly askew, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He had initially dismissed Mo's casual attire, automatically categorizing him as someone unimportant. Now, the weight of his misjudgment pressed heavily upon him. He replayed the scene at the entrance, the way he had deferred to Chloe's judgment without question. "I'm supposed to be the manager," he thought, a wave of self-reproach washing over him. I should have handled that differently. Mo's words, quiet yet firm, had shaken him to his core. He had spent so long upholding an illusion of exclusivity. He'd forgotten the true meaning of hospitality. He looked at Mo, a new resolve hardening his gaze. He wouldn't let this man down. He would help build the kind of restaurant Mo envisioned. Jaden, the youngest of the group, stood near the edge of the room, his eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and awe. He had witnessed the entire exchange, from Chloe's initial snub to Mo's calm assertion of authority. The shift in power dynamics had been palpable, a silent earthquake that had reshaped the very foundation of the restaurant. He had always admired Chloe's confidence, the way she commanded the room. But now he saw a different kind of strength in Mo, a quiet confidence that stemmed not from outward appearances, but from something deeper, something more profound. He felt a sense of excitement, a sense of possibility. This is going to be different, he thought, a hopeful smile touching his lips. This is going to be good. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words and shifting perspectives. Mo broke it, his voice calm and steady. He looked at each of them, his gaze lingering for a moment on Chloe, then on Daryl, finally settling on Jaden. From now on, he began, his voice resonating with a quiet authority. Anyone who walks through that door is a guest. They deserve our respect, our attention, our best, regardless of what they're wearing, regardless of where they come from. He paused, letting his words sink in. The faint clinking of silverware from the dining room filtered into the lounge, a subtle reminder of the world outside, a world waiting to be welcomed. He continued, his voice softening slightly. This wasn't about ego. This wasn't about making a point. He met Chloe's gaze, holding it for a beat longer than necessary. This was about reminding y'all that the next person you turn away might just leave and never come back. And they might take a little piece of this place with them when they go. He gestured around the room, encompassing the plush furniture, the elegant decor, the intangible atmosphere that had once defined Maison DuLac. We can't afford to lose those pieces, he concluded, his voice low and resonant. We can't afford to lose our soul. A collective exhale swept through the room, the tension finally breaking. Chloe lowered her gaze, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of shame and newfound understanding. Daryl straightened his tie, a spark of determination in his eyes. Jaden nodded slowly, absorbing Mo's words like a thirsty plant soaking up rain. The air, once thick with apprehension, now felt lighter, charged with a different kind of energy. An energy of change, of possibility, of hope. The meeting was over, but the real work had just begun. The transformation of Maison DuLac had begun not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet conversation, a subtle shift in perspective, a shared understanding that true hospitality transcended the superficial. It resonated from the heart. The heavy oak door of Maison DuLac swung closed behind him, the faint click echoing the subtle shift in power that had just occurred within its hallowed walls. The Louisiana sun, a humid blanket draped over Lafayette, warmed Mo's skin as he stepped onto the sidewalk. He paused, the ornate ironwork of the restaurant sign catching his eye. Maison DuLac, House of the Lake. He wondered, not for the first time that day, if the name held any irony, any hint of the stagnant prejudices that lurked beneath its polished veneer. He ran a hand through his hair, the slight breeze doing little to dispel the lingering tension from the encounter. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene. His power lay not in overt displays, but in the quiet knowledge of his position, a silent current capable of reshaping the very foundations of the establishment. Chloe's face, a mixture of mortification and dawning comprehension, replayed in his mind. He felt a flicker of something akin to sympathy, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of her initial dismissal, the casual disdain in her eyes as she directed him towards a deli. A deli! He almost chuckled at the absurdity of it. He, the majority owner, offered a sandwich instead of a seat at his own table. The rhythmic clip of his boots on the pavement punctuated his thoughts. He hadn't intended to make an example of anyone. Not really. His initial goal had been simple: observe, assess, and subtly correct. But Chloe's prejudice had been so blatant, so casually ingrained, it had forced his hand. The restaurant's atmosphere, the carefully curated ambience of exclusivity, was tainted, polluted by the unspoken assumption that appearance dictated worth. He needed to dismantle that assumption, brick by carefully chosen brick. Daryl's swift change in demeanor, the eager deference that replaced his initial indifference, hadn't escaped Mo's notice. It was a stark reminder of how easily power dynamics could shift, how quickly masks could be donned and discarded. He wondered about the sincerity of Daryl's commitment to change. Time would tell. He reached the corner, the bustling street, a stark contrast to the hushed elegance of the restaurant he'd just left. The aroma of beignet from a nearby cafe mingled with the exhaust fumes of passing cars, a strange yet somehow fitting juxtaposition. He inhaled deeply, the scent grounding him, reminding him of the world outside the gilded cage of Maison DuLac. He thought of Jaden, the young waiter, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Jaden hadn't spoken much, but his silence had been more telling than any words. He'd witnessed the subtle power play, the unspoken rules that governed the restaurant's social hierarchy. Perhaps, Mo mused, Jaden would be the true catalyst for change. Unburdened by years of ingrained prejudice, he might be more receptive to a new way of thinking, a new definition of respect. Mo stopped at the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. The sun beat down on him, a physical reminder of the weight he carried, the responsibility he'd inherited. It wasn't just about owning a restaurant. It was about shaping a culture, about challenging the deeply rooted prejudices that infected so many aspects of society. He thought about his grandmother, her quiet dignity in the face of countless acts of discrimination. She had taught him the power of resilience, the importance of fighting for what was right, even when the battle seemed insurmountable. He straightened his shoulders, a renewed sense of purpose settling within him. He wouldn't shy away from this challenge. He would dismantle the walls of prejudice, one interaction at a time. The walk sign flashed, and he crossed the street, his stride purposeful, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The encounter at Maison DuLac was just the beginning. It was a microcosm of a larger struggle, a battle against the insidious nature of prejudice. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be resistance, perhaps even outright hostility. But he also knew that he couldn't afford to give up. The stakes were too high. As he walked, a single thought echoed in his mind, a mantra of sorts, a reminder of the core message he wanted to convey. Respect isn't earned through attire, through wealth, or through social standing. Respect is a fundamental right, inherent in every human being, regardless of their appearance, their background, or their place in the world. It's a simple truth, yet so often forgotten. And it was a truth he intended to uphold, one quiet revolution at a time. The world, he realized, was full of Maison DuLacs, each with its own set of unspoken rules, its own hidden biases. And he, in his own quiet way, intended to change them all.